Lord God, we thank you for being trustworthy and for being with us. Open our hearts and minds to you. In your name we pray. Amen. So I want to begin today by saying my wife and I, those of you who know us, we have this kind of intense relationship. We are both college athletes, both captains of our college athletic teams, and we're both very strong sort of personalities. And sometimes, you know, when we're having conversations, things get a little bit intense. And I'm not saying that I would ever do this, but if I ever wanted to make my wife really, really upset, and we're having this kind of heated discussion about, you know, money or finances or something, I'll say, Lindsay, just calm down. and you can like watch the steam start blowing out of her ears, or like you see the intensity of her eyes just sort of snap to this really intense place. It's sort of like, what did you just say to me? And so I tell that story because it kind of reminds me of our passage for today. Here, Jesus is saying, don't let your heart be troubled. Trust in God, trust also in me. And he, you know, if I really want to make Lindsay upset, not that I would ever do something like this, but if you say it a little bit condescendingly, that seems to add to the joy of the conversation. Makes everything go a lot better. The good news is that's not what Jesus is doing here today. And so in my sermon today, I want to look a little bit about, kind of look at the text itself, because this is John 14. This is some of the best meat in the entire Bible. A lot of the commentators talk about this being sort of the highlight of John. You could say maybe John 3:16 is also an important one. But John 14, especially 14:6, is one of the key portions of Scripture in the Gospel of John. And so I want to spend some time looking at that a little bit, and then move into this sort of idea of trust. And the good news is, in this text, what Jesus is doing here is if we kind of look at the context, like Terry mentioned a little bit, Jesus has just told Peter that he's going to deny him 3 times. He's been talking about dying, and I'm sure his disciples are starting to feel a little bit of anxiety. Now, when I tell my wife to calm down, usually it's just to throw gas on the fire. But then also, the other thing that's going on is I don't usually have anything to sort of say, calm down, because here's what we're going to do. Once we get to the more rational portion of our conversations, we get to that point. But here we have Jesus sort of like telling us this, and it not really like sitting that way, because he moves right into sort of why God's trustworthy. So let me start by looking at this passage, and I want to lift up a few verses in particular and talk about kind of the funness that's happening sort of behind the text a little bit, and then talk about a little bit about sort of our trust and what it's saying to us as a congregation today. So it starts out, do not let your hearts be troubled. Trust in God, trust also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you. I am going there to prepare a place for you. And I want to really look at this second verse in particular, in my Father's house. So Jesus, Greek's really fun. It's hard, but it's fun. And there's some things going on in the Greek here that are pretty fascinating. So there's a word for house in Greek, and it's not the word that's used here. What happens is there's a word called meno, and it's a verb. It means to dwell or to abide or to be with. And the author here has taken that word and changed it into a noun to mean house, so dwelling place. And it's within grammar, it makes sense, that sort of thing. But what's going on here is it's not so much a house like a literal place. It's more of a relationship. And so what Jesus is talking about here is not necessarily like the house of God, but sort of the relational aspect, the intimacy that Jesus has with God. For those of you who ever lived with somebody else, you'll know that when you live with them in the same home, there's a certain degree of intimacy that happens. My wife's whole family is with us right now, which is really fun. We haven't been having any of our intense discussions lately. But, people, I don't know if you've noticed, but we seem to have family in town all the time. One is because we live in San Diego, and they live in Minnesota, and I think in Minnesota right now there's still about 2.5 feet of snow, and it's a really nice day. It's like 38 degrees. Spring is like right around the corner. Just a few more weeks of 38-degree weather, and all the snow will be gone. So in the winter, it's a pretty popular place, especially for Lindsay's grandparents. They've been with us for a couple weeks. But But they're in Minnesota, and we're here, and that's kind of challenging. And Lindsay's family especially, my family too, but we have just wonderful families, and we love spending time with them. And so when they come to visit us, yeah, we could ship off to a hotel, but we're sort of missing out on the intimacy of sort of our day-to-day lives together. And so when they come, we want them to stay with us. Like if they don't want to stay in our house, we get really upset. Like, oh my gosh, you have to stay with us. And so I think Lindsay's mom has tried to pawn herself off on a hotel because, you know, if you go to somebody else's house and you're forced to stay in the house with them, and like right now there's 9 people in our little house, that 1,200 square foot house. The 2 little boys who are waking up in the middle of the night and screaming, that sort of thing. It's not that much fun. But there's this intimacy that you miss out on if you're not kind of all together. And that's the sort of intimacy that Jesus is talking about in his Father's house, this sort of abiding or dwelling. And it's not so much a place, it's this sort of, in this whole text you're going to see this, it's this sort of indwelling of being together. So continuing on, it says, "And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you also may be where I am. You know the way to the place where I am going." And what's fascinating here is it's starting to get into this, so we have this sort of conception. When you first read through this passage, you're like, okay, there's a house, and then there's a path to get there, and then Thomas is confused, what is the path? And then Jesus says, I am the path. But actually, this way that is being talked about is not a literal sort of like path. It's not like when I go to my house, I drive up the 5. It's not like that. The way that they're talking about here is sort of a wisdom or a knowledge or understanding. And this is a concept that's coming out of the Old Testament that Jesus is sort of picking up on here. This concept of the way. In the end of Deuteronomy, after God has given Moses all of the 10 Commandments, God says to Moses, do not turn to the right or to the left, but walk in the way that I have shown you. And so there's this sense that there's a way. And this way is not like a path per se, but it's more of an understanding or a wisdom, that sort of thing. So we continue, and Thomas is wonderful in the book of John. Thomas says to him, Lord, we don't know where you're going, so how can we know the way? You know, it's kind of like when we think about, if we know the place, we can usually get there. So when I have meetings with people, I'm like, well, just text me the address, I'll drop it in my phone, and then my GPS will take me there. So I'll know the way if I know my final sort of destination. But Thomas isn't quite understanding what Jesus is getting at here. He's sort of missing the point that this is not sort of a path, but it's more of an indwelling of a knowledge. And so Jesus responds to Thomas by saying, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And so this kind of, I hope I'm confusing you because it's kind of confusing. I have my mentor pastor at my previous church in Minneapolis, in our new member class, he kind of talked about this passage, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. And the way he talked about it actually was really helpful for me to sort of understand, okay, what does this mean? And it's sort of, they all sort of build on each other. So the first thing is the way of Jesus. So Jesus is literally the way, and it's not as though Jesus has shown us the way or Jesus has taught us the way. Jesus literally is the way. So one of the commentaries was saying a good sort of paraphrase of this passage that's been around for a long time is, all the way to heaven is heaven. In the sense that Jesus, all the way to wherever our destination is Jesus. And Jesus is with us, Jesus is indwelling with us, and Jesus is a part of who we are. And so it's not as though we're walking beside Jesus, Jesus literally is a part of who we are. And there's this deep sort of connection that's going on throughout this passage. So my mentor pastor was talking to a new member class at the previous church I was at. He sort of explained it like this. He said, these things all build on each other, and the way of Jesus is literally sort of walking or thinking the same way as Jesus. So it fits really well with this sermon series of seeing God through Jesus' eyes. But this doesn't even, you don't necessarily even have to believe in Jesus at this point. You just start walking in the way of Jesus, kind of following in his footsteps, viewing the world through Jesus' eyes. And as you start being in the way of Jesus, then the truth starts to really come alive. And so we can't understand the truth of Jesus without being in the way of Jesus. And I think this is a place where a lot of Christians sort of get confused, as they say, okay, I've learned the truths of the Bible, and now I'm going to walk on my way to heaven, and thanks for the help, Jesus, but now I got it. When actually, to be a Christian is to be in the way of Jesus, to have Jesus indwelling our hearts, seeing the world through Jesus' eyes, walking the way that Jesus walked, interacting the way that Jesus did. As we do that, the truth starts to sort of pop. And we start to see more deeply than we ever have before the love that God has for us, the compassion that God has, the truth, the trust that we can place in our God. All those truths become a lot more evident. And then, once you understand those truths, then the life of Christ becomes possible. So it's the way, the truth, and the life. So you need to be in the way, and then the truth starts to make sense. And then the life of Christ starts to become full, and you start to live into it. And this life of Christ, there's these prosperity gospel folks that run around and say you're going to be healthy, wealthy, and wise if you're a Christian. Hopefully we all know that's not true. But the life of Christ is one of joy, of compassion, of purpose. It has a lot deeper meaning than any of these sort of worldly criteria that we want to use. And so one example that I want to give of this is last week I went with a group called Friends of Los Niños down to some orphanages in Mexico. Now, our missions committee has designated 1% of our church budget to Friends of Los Niños, and it's kind of this parent organization that we trust to determine which orphanages are viable, which orphanages are doing good work, which orphanages are worthwhile to sort of send our money to. And so we have someone that's down there kind of looking at things, checking things out. And occasionally, the guy that's the director of this organization, his name's Claude, and myself and some folks from one of the pastors from the Village Church Rancho Santa Fe, their missions committee, we went down to visit some of these orphanages. And it was a pretty intense day, because orphanages are intense. And having two little boys, especially one of the orphanages we went to that we're no longer supporting, it was kind of a rough situation. But there's these little boys kind of in this pen, like wanting me to pick them up. It was rough. It was a rough day. But the day started in a place that was, it was both easier and more intense than even the last place we went. It was easier because the kids weren't there, they were all at school. But it was more intense because as we sat down with this person that runs this orphanage, we got to hear a little bit of her story. So this particular orphanage is a place for kids who are terminal or terminally ill. So they either have some sort of genetic disorder, or one of them was HIV positive, cerebral palsy, some of these things where these children are not going to live full lives. They're going to live for a while. They're not like going to die. They're not in hospice care per se, but they're just, their futures are sort of shortened. And it was started by two sisters that took a group of babies in that all had these. And these two sisters these two Catholic nuns raised these children for about 10 or 12 years. Now what happened is one of the nuns ended up dying in a car accident, and the other nun got sick and had to leave. And this all happened probably about 1.5 years ago. And so there was these interim caretakers that are sort of taking care of these children, and it was just sort of a job. They weren't doing a super great job. Things were getting a little bit rough. And there's this Catholic nonprofit organization in Idaho that was coming down to do some work in this orphanage. They were doing some renovating, new tile. They moved some walls around to give some of the kids a little bit more room. And this young woman came with them. She's 25 years old. She's from Idaho. She came down in January, did some work with them. They came again in March, did some more work. And then in June, it was the third time she'd been there. And one day the caretakers didn't come back. So this young woman, she's 25 years old, she's a Boise State grad with psychology, she decided to stay. And so now she's the primary caregiver for all these, there's 8 kids, they're all teenagers now. 8 teenagers in one house that all have sort of different stuff going on. But that's sort of what the life of Christ might start looking like. You think of the sort of a level of faith that someone would have to do something like that. That's the sort of life that Christ is calling us to, those sort of things. And I have a bunch of other stories. This sermon, the first time I ran through it was like an hour and 20 minutes long. So I was like, oh, there's all this good stuff. So my voice is a little bit gone because I've been like, oh wait, this is too long. So I'm going to cut some stories out. Other stories like that. You ask me about them because I have a whole bunch of really beautiful stories of God, of people sort of trusting God. But what I want to get to is this sort of theme of trust that's coming out of this passage. And think about us as a congregation here today. And one of the problems that we have is we're in this society that is I would say, toxic to trust. We're in this society that is so toxic to any sort of trust. And anytime any trust starts happening, it just gets sort of attacked and mauled. And kind of preparation for this, one of the things I've heard a lot about is like there's this decreasing trust in institutions. And so I was doing some research and came across some research by the Pew, there's a Pew study that was done in 2013. And the millennials came up. So anytime I hear millennials, I kind of like lock onto that. Because that's folks that are 18 to 20, or 18 to 32. So people born after 1980 up until the late 90s, sort of 18 to 32 is sort of the millennials. They're the largest upcoming generation. And in the study, they asked, I think the question was something like, do you feel like most people are trustworthy? And 19% of millennials said yes. So if you got 10 people like me in a room and asked them if you thought people were trustworthy, 2 would say yes. Okay, so that's a problem. That's a problem because you can't, if you have that level of distrust of just about everything, you can't build anything. And one of the things that I think is a direct result of that is also in the same study, 26% of people under 30 are married. Or 26% have gotten married. Now, I think back to like my grandparents, for instance. My grandpa was 20 and my grandma was 19 when they got married. And looking at my peers, there's this little group of people that kind of got married right out of college. The 26%, I guess. And then the rest of my friends, some of them have been in relationships, some of them haven't. There are a lot of people that they're not willing to trust anybody in this younger generation. And it's this sort of culturally systemic sort of thing going on, of this lack of trust. Now, lack of trust in institutions, lack of trust in churches, lack of trust in relationships, lack of trust in God even. And so this is a problem because we can't build anything. We can't create things. We can't, God is this creator and sort of brings things together, brings order out of chaos. And so we have some problems here. And then that got me thinking about this particular congregation. And where are we at on this sort of scale of trust? Now, I think first off, I've been here a little over 3 years now, and I've seen deep, deep levels of trust amongst individuals within our congregation. People have deep trust for one another inside our congregation, and so that it's a really beautiful congregation as you get to know it. I think Tim has found this to be true. But we're in this sort of time of reflection. We just did the session retreat. We're going to be hiring a senior pastor, hopefully sometime in 2014. Praise Jesus. And so it got me sort of thinking, and I want to tell you a story that I think sort of talks a little bit about where I think we're at as a church in terms of our trust congregationally. Now, when I was in high school, many of you know I was a wrestler, and I'd had quite a bit of success. I've talked about my high school wrestling team going 74-1, winning 2 state championships, and then my college team, Division III, we won 3 national championships while I was there. So I've always been a part of really good teams. And then myself personally, I've had some really, great successes in wrestling. When I was 16, I represented the United States at the World Youth Games in Russia and got 5th. And so my senior year of high school, I had this goal since 2nd grade when I started wrestling to be a state champion. And the only state championship that really matters is the high school state championship. Because the Greco freestyle stuff, not everybody's doing that. So I had this goal. And my senior year, I moved up to heavyweight, way easier weight than 189. Because the heavyweights, a lot of them showed up when they were little kids, they showed up tournaments. They were like 40 pounds bigger than any other kid, so they got their first place trophy and then they went home. And they'd pay their entry fee and get their trophy and then they'd go home. And so, talking about like mat time, a sermon I preached a while back about mat time, that sort of thing, none of the heavyweights have any. And so moving from the 189 weight class to heavyweight weight class, oh, this is going to be easy. And kind of looking around the state, seeing like who was at that weight in my division and thinking, I'm going to have a really good year. This is going to be fun. One, because I'm pretty decent, and two, because there's not really a whole lot of competition. Maybe more the latter than the former. Yeah, more the latter than the former. But anyway, last football game of the season, we're in the quarterfinals for football, and I tore the inside ligament on my knee, the MCL I think it was. And that doesn't require surgery, but you can't really do much. So I was out for 6 weeks, first 6 weeks of the season, out. And I'm trying to train and stay in shape and that sort of thing, but I couldn't wrestle. And my backup, there's a guy a year behind me that was wrestling for me. He was doing really well as well. He had made the same jump I had. And came back right after Christmas, wrestled for about a week. And wrestling is a sport where you can be in pretty good shape, but if you don't have the timing down and all that, it's a little rough. So I was trying to get my timing back down, that sort of thing, working really hard my first week back. First weekend, I go to a tournament in South Dakota, and my second or third wrestling match, all of a sudden my knee locks, where I can't move it. And what had happened is when I tore my ligament, I also had torn some cartilage, and didn't realize it at the time, and like 6 weeks later, just when I'm about to get back into it, my knee locks up. Well, at that age, knee surgeries for a 17-year-old guy are not that big of a deal. They did orthoscopic. I was back on the mat in 12 days. And which was quick, but at the same time I felt great, and I was like, all right, we're going to do this. Here we come. The problem is I had this other guy that had been wrestling my weight all season, and so the way it works in wrestling is you have a wrestle-off, and you have like a head-to-head competition in the wrestling room, and whoever wins becomes the person that represents the team. And this guy had beat him 8-0, 9-0 every single time we'd have a wrestle-off. So the first wrestle-off, I needed to beat him to get into, we were about to go into the qualifying tournament, the state tournament. The first match I beat him 5-3. And I'm thinking to myself, that was a lot closer than what we'd ever had before. Well, I'm just getting him out of bounds, that sort of thing. The second match, I lose to him 2-0. So now it's best of 3. And the third match, I lose to him 1-0. And this is my senior year. I trained since second grade. It was like my life dream to be state champion. And now I don't even get a chance to compete. And the kid went on. He walked through the whole state tournament, ended up in the finals against a guy I'd beaten a bunch of times, lost by like a point or something. So he got second state. But it was really crushing. I mean, you think about that sort of like crushing, like it just sort of got ripped out of my hands. And I put everything into wrestling. Every morning I woke up, I did push-ups. Every night when I went to bed, I did sit-ups. I got my sleep. I ate really well. I was like, I put 100% into this sort of thing. And it just sort of, and was gone. So that was the first time. So I go to college, and I have a couple shoulder surgeries. My sophomore, junior seasons, I don't wrestle a full season. My senior year, I'm coming in, and my coach had this habit of recruiting Division I athletes in when there's a hole in the spot. So these guys would flunk out of a Division I school. They'd flunk out. They'd come to our team, and our coach would give them like 5 tutors, and they'd get a college degree. It's really kind of a neat ministry. Think about it. These guys that come to my team, they're phenomenal wrestlers, but they're not super engaged with academics. My coach would give them 5 tutors and basically just haul them to graduation. And so, my sophomore and junior year, he had done this. He had recruited Division I guys in to wrestle for a year. My senior year, I was it. I was the guy. We had just come off a national championship. This was it. I'd been training all summer, lifting 6 days a week. This is going to happen. First tournament of the year, I'm walking through the tournament. I went 3 matches. I had like tech falls, pins, and I'm walking through. I'm in the semifinals against a kid that he was a really small heavyweight, maybe about 200 pounds. I was like 260. So this size, except all muscle instead of other stuff like now. And he does this funky move. It's like the third period. I'm up like 9-1 or something. He does this funky move where I stand up. He's behind me, and he jumps up, and he hits me behind my knees with his shins, which is not a real wrestling move. He just kind of made it up. And all of a sudden, I feel my knee slip. And I was like, so I fall back down. I'm like, that was really weird. What was that? I try to stand up again. It sort of slips again. I end up winning the match by laying on the ground last minute. Walk over to the trainer and I'm like, something's kind of goofy. I don't know what's going on. So she like pulls on my knee, gets this really sick look on her face because she's been through it with me for this whole thing. And she's like, your ACL is gone. It's gone. You're done. I mean, you're done. And so, you know, this is like time number 2, right? And ACL is like a 12-month recovery, especially for a wrestler because it's such an intense sort of like, you have to have good body awareness, that sort of thing. So, you know, I did all the recovery, came back for my 5th year, had maybe, I think I got 500. I think I won half my matches, but I couldn't engage in the way I wanted to. And part of it, and I'm just sort of realizing this now as I'm working through some stuff for just kind of thinking about who I am and my leadership and that sort of thing. And this story, I think, has really deeply affected me because anytime that I really, really poured everything I had into something, it sort of got taken away. And it got me thinking about this church. Like, there's something about this church where we're sort of like stuck, or I'm not sure. It just something doesn't feel quite right. And I think the story of my wrestling career maybe could shed some light on it because, you know, as we were shuffling around, finding all this stuff for a mission self-study, I found one of the pamphlets for our capital campaign that we did in like 2004, 2003, something like that. And I was looking through it, and there's some pretty phenomenal leaders that were in charge of that. And there are people that are still here. There are people I deeply love and care about, and they're good folks. And so the idea was we were going to build a sanctuary. And since I've gotten here, I've kind of like, what went wrong? What happened? And looking at the goal I think was 1.5 million. And then kind of doing some research, we raised 1.6. We beat our goal for what we wanted to do. But the problem was that the church was going to cost a lot more than what we thought it was going to. And so here we are. We put all this time and energy into this capital campaign. The church, and up to this point, this church had been having 10, 15% growth year after year in giving, in membership, all that sort of stuff. And we put all this effort into it. And then it's like it didn't happen. It didn't happen. And I think maybe what happened, and this is just hear me out here. This is really thin ice, but we've got a lot of snow cover, and it's only been 38 degrees a few days here. But part of me thinks, what if God didn't want us to build a sanctuary? Because in my head, I'm adding up, you know, if we would have done it, we would have been in debt a ways further than we were. And interest on debt, you know, we have to service that. That's a fair bit of money. And then I got to thinking, you know, this church gives 10% of its money to stuff that happens outside of our walls. And you add that up over the last 10 years, and that's $500,000 that this church has poured into stuff around us. And I don't know if we would have been able to do that if we had built a sanctuary. And so when we start to think about trusting God, what if God knew better than we knew for ourselves what we should be up to? And God wanted to do some amazing ministry in Carlsbad and Tijuana, all the sort of things that we've poured our mission money into. What if that's what God wanted for us? And so as we think about what it looks like to trust God as a congregation, or even on an individual level, sometimes what we think we want isn't what God has planned for us. And we have to be people that are able to trust God and to walk in the way that God has set before us so that we can know the truth and live the life that God has provided. May it be so. Amen.